everybody. Make a start on the second of the afternoon's papers. It's a pleasure to welcome to these seminars Greg Bankoff. Greg is a historical geographer who's most recently been Professor of Environmental History at the University of Hull. He is a historical geographer who has worked very extensively over time on the way in which people adapt to frequent hazards. Much of his earlier work has been on Southeast Asia, Central Asia, the Pacific, and the North Sea. But on this occasion, he's talking about internal drainage boards and water level management in the River Hull Valley, which is exactly the subject of the question we had from Mary Carrick a few moments ago.
It is indeed.
So let us, with no more ado, hear Greg on an area which has had very little attention, the internal drainage boards.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, thank you for that introduction, Richard. So I don't really have to explain who I am and what I'm doing and where I'm coming from, but I am particularly interested in the idea of how people live with risk, especially frequent risk. And I think my paper follows on quite nicely from Susan's in the sense that she was talking about landscape, and I really want to talk about the management of those kinds of waterscapes or watery landscapes. So I'm going to pass very quickly through the first 3 or 4 slides for the sake of time here, but suffice it to say that this research is part of an AHRC research grant looking at internal drainage boards and how local communities managed flooding in 4 case studies across England, one of which is the East Riding of Yorkshire. And what we're trying to do in this project is really look at examining historical precedences in flood risk management at the local level as a potential model for future practices. This means that really what we're doing is not just doing archival work, the sort of classical work that you expect historians to do, but very much field work as well. And I call this approach really a sort of an applied history approach. And it's applied history because it requires an expanded toolkit that borrows methodological instruments from many other disciplines, both from the humanities, but also from the social sciences and the physical sciences as well. So give you an idea of the kinds of research methodologies we're using, not just your archival research or oral histories, but life narratives, participant observation, interviews, focus group discussions, transect interviews, surveys, community mapping and transects, scenario building, and even film. And I'm quite happy in the question time to talk more about this approach, but I want to get on to the sort of more historical part of the substantial historical part of the talk. So as I said, I'm looking at internal drainage boards, and I want to begin off with a quote from an engineer for the Cottingham Internal Drainage Board, which used to be one of the drainage boards within the Hull River Valley, no longer exists. And this engineer is reporting on a bottleneck that he's experiencing, one of the principal culverts in the area. And he's writing to the Internal Drainage Board, and he says that the problem was due to the culvert not being, I'm quoting here now, constructed as a whole, but piecemeal over a considerable number of years and by different parties, so that it is not of uniform section and construction throughout. So what appears to be in many ways really rather a routine description of the mundane nature and the difficulties posed in resolving it epitomizes, in my opinion, the drainage history of the River Hull Valley and stands as an exemplar for the problematic development of non-main watercourses in much of lowland England over the centuries. So if I'm going to expand on this metaphor, what I'm really saying here is that no one set out to comprehensively plan the drainage of the River Hull Valley, and there was no master plan for the area, but rather over 900 years, a network of dikes and drains, of sluices and spillways, of penstocks and pumps expanded piecemeal into the system that exists today. But the nature of this infrastructure meant, however, that decisions once made were very costly to alter, and the range of practical alternatives were thereby limited. Moreover, once entrenched, the people and institutions that ran these networks had a vested interest in maintaining the existing system and really had very little stomach for radical change. Nor did the authors of this expansion share even a common purpose in what they were doing. To some, it was about facilitating transport. To most, of course, it was about improving drainage. And to still others, it was about flood mitigation. But it's the historical sequence in which contingent or events that cannot be predicted sets in motion institutional patterns or chains of events that have deterministic properties that can best be described as path-dependent. And the resultant system is one characterized by what can be called lock-in, in which the positive feedbacks produced by the prevalent structural or institutional patterns make it very difficult to actually modify or abolish what is already there. Now that seems a little bit convoluted and difficult. Hopefully in the rest of my talk that will become much clearer what I mean by that. And what I'm trying to say here is the history of drainage in the River Hull Valley and the challenges that it and other lowland regions of England currently face can really only be understood by this path-dependent lock-in that actually explains the system as it currently is. That's a few words about internal drainage boards, because not many people actually know what they are. Because the institution that oversaw this transformation in the Hull River Valley and in many other parts of lowland England is the Internal Drainage Board and its predecessors, which we'll call by other names, of course. And this institution was entirely local in both composition and reach, and its history is really very surprisingly not well known. For an institution that has played such a central role in land drainage and flood risk management, IDBs are rarely discussed outside of those who own agricultural land liable for the drainage rate. And yet such local water boards are one of the oldest, quite possibly the oldest form of representative local governance in England. In one form or another, for the last 800 or 900 years, local landowners and farmers have been charged with the organization and maintenance of an expanding network of embankments and channels. Of course, they were known in the past rather prosaically as drains and sewers, which might explain why people haven't looked at them, that drains approximately 10% of England. Currently, there are 112 internal drainage boards. Up until very recently, there were many, many more. There's been a lot of amalgamation in recent years, recent decades. They operate in an area covering about 1.2 million hectares of land. They run 500 pumping stations. They maintain 22,000 kilometers of watercourses, and they drain, in fact, some of the most fertile agricultural land in the country, as well as actually now draining substantial urban and industrial areas. Today, each IDB operates within a defined area in which it has permissive powers, but not duties, under the Land Drainage Act of 1991 and the Flood and Water Management Act of 2010. And they're charged with undertaking water level management and flood defense works other than on main rivers. So what's my argument here? Well, my argument here is that through an examination of this one specific lowland area in the East Riding of Yorkshire, and the activities of a single IDB, that is the Beverly and North Holderness IDB and its predecessors, it is possible to explore the underlying dynamics at work throughout the greater IDB network that largely defines the English lowlands. It is important to understand both how the problem was made, one section at a time, without any overarching scheme for the system as a whole, and how the entrenched sectoral interests created in that process have frustrated any plans to impose a sort of master plan upon it until it was too late and what had been done was virtually impossible to have undone. The systematic lock-in uncovered by recounting this local history is then characteristic of water level management over much of the IDB network in England today. The path dependence by which it was fashioned was as much institutional, however, as it was physical, and made and makes any substantial alteration to the system difficult and prohibitively expensive to realize. So let's turn first to just sketching out the making of the Hull River Valley. This history has already been written. June Shepherd back in the 1950s wrote some of the best accounts of how this was done. The River Hull Valley has been marsh for much of its history. It formed part of the third largest stretch, or did form part of the third largest stretch of wetland in England. The landscape itself appears dull. It's a flat expanse of fertile land. To many people, it's hardly even a valley. It's very difficult to actually tell where the eastern slopes are at all. And down the western half of the valley flows the River Hull. The River Hull Valley, however, was never planned in its entirety. It developed in this piecemeal section as times dictated or circumstances allowed. Attempts at improvement began in the valley after 1066 with the establishment of extensive land holdings, many of them monastic. And by the 1660s, the lower valley was reasonably well drained, though still subject to major inundations, such as in 1646. The great age of drainage was between 1760 and 1880, where many schemes were drawn up to improve the drainage and empower new bodies of trustees with wide powers to improve the land, so basically laying down the main features of the drainage system as it exists today. Here's a map of basically what it looks like now as the drainage area of the River Hull Valley, and you can see the dark line here is the River Hull, and these dotted lines are the main drains beside it, and of course many subsidiary drains. Beginning in 1763, attempts were made to envisage the valley as a single drainage area. And in fact, some of the most prominent engineers of the day, people like John Grundy, John Smeaton, William Jessup, were commissioned to draw up plans for arranging the, coordinating the drainage of the valley. All three engineers proposed schemes in the late 18th century that basically involved the construction of major drains in the east and the west, as you can see on the map there, raising the east bank of the river, amalgamating and enlarging existing dikes, and opening a new outlet to the Humber at Marfleet. However, the point about these is that schemes were never fully implemented, either because they were too costly or because they threatened the vested interests like the ship owners of the Port of Hull. Still, the main features of the drainage system that exists today were laid down at this time, and these measures did improve drainage, though they did not solve the problem of drainage, especially in the upper River Hull Valley, and flooding remained commonplace right into the 19th century. As I said, the outlines of this history have already largely been written. But what I want to look at is focus, however, on how the options available to today's decision makers about tomorrow's future are really circumscribed by the decisions taken in the past for reasons that may actually have very little to do with current realities. The institutional patterns established and the physical outcomes that are the result of those arrangements impede the implementation of radical solutions and narrow the range of decision making. This is path dependence. Those historical sequences in which contingent events or events that cannot be predicted set in motion institutional patterns or chains of events that have deterministic properties, or basically one where what happens in the earlier part of the process matters more than what happens later, have been characterized as path dependent. Now, there are two types of path dependent sequences. One is called self-reinforcing, and the other is called reactive. Self-reinforcing sequences are characterized by the long-term reproduction of given institutional patterns whose continuation, once adopted, delivers increasing returns or benefits that make it very difficult to change or select an alternative option, even if that option is actually more efficient, clearly more efficient. Still, it doesn't get taken. Reactive sequences are chains of causally connected events initiated more in a random manner, in which each subsequent event is directly dependent on and is a reaction to the one before. And we can see evidence of both forms of path dependence in the historical drainage of the River Hull Valley. The reactive sequences in terms of the physical infrastructure created over the centuries, and the self-reinforcing sequences with respect to the institutional patterns of local water level management that have evolved over the years. I want to look at these in turn. We look first of all at infrastructural path dependence. The present drainage network is the outcome of a series of random decisions taken by individuals and not the result of any master design. Later improvements just built on the existing network of watercourses and were carried out piecemeal by groups of trustees envisaging profits from draining either this section or that section of the River Hull Valley, but without any image of the whole system as a network. That is, a network of drains grew incrementally, the next step largely dependent on the one before, and often, in fact, a reaction to the changes in water flow wrought by the works previously undertaken. You drain one bit, of course, it means that the water goes to another section and so on. The drainage infrastructure of the River Hull Valley, therefore, exhibits all the elements of path dependence. Contingency in its inception, and here we could go back to looking how the original the original canals were actually built by the Abbey of Meaux, largely thought to be for navigation purposes. A chain of events in which each step is dependent on prior steps, the absence or non-implementation of a master plan, and the unfolding reactive nature of drain construction in the valley, and deterministic, the opposition of shipping interests in the port of Hull to alternative outlets to the Humber. Path dependence, it may only be manifest it's not only manifest in the infrastructural nature of the drainage, but it's also manifest in the institutional organization and in the slow ways they have changed. The ways IDBs function today can be traced right back to the marsh law of Romney Marsh of 1257. These laws were still very much in practice in William Dugdale's 1662 treatise, and even under the present system of trustees stemming from the Acts of Parliament in the late 18th century that replaced the appointed commissioners, and created the individual drainage boards, much the same landowning proprietors, now nominally elected, continued to administer affairs in much the same way, serving much the same interests. The degree to which an institutional pattern of administration has been reproduced suggests a positive feedback mechanism whereby a structure, once adopted, delivers increasing benefits to those involved, and so becomes difficult to change or to select an alternative, as I said, even if the latter proves to be more efficient. As Herbert Sheffield, clerk to the Beverly and Barnston drains, commented in 1927, quote, "If all these old liabilities could be swept away and a uniform system of taxation applicable to the district affected devised, it would be of undoubted advantage. But it would be an almost impossible task and would arouse the very strongest opposition by the owners of those lands, so that it would have to be carried out by compulsory legislation, as no voluntary system would ever be agreed to." And the unwieldy nature of the present IDB boards, a voting system that basically promotes larger landowners. The more land you have, the more votes you have, and an elective cycle that entrenches incumbents, constitutes basically, I would argue, a self-reinforcing institutional practice that favors a system of governance that serves the interests of its own members, and that is characteristic of path dependence. So once these mechanisms of path dependence are established, they lock in a structural and/or institutional pattern whose positive feedbacks make it extremely difficult to modify or abolish. The manner in which the network of drains developed in the Hull River Valley over the centuries locked in a particular orientation to the infrastructure that makes it impossible to radically change except at huge costs and great socioeconomic disruptions. The grand schemes of the second half of the 18th century drawn up for improvements were never fully implemented, as attempts to reduce the flow of water down the River Hull met with the opposition from the maritime and commercial interests of the Port of Hull. These worthy gentlemen believed that the full force of the river was necessary to scour out the silt out of the old docks at the river's mouth, and their opposition remained during the 19th century until new docks were constructed as the course of the 19th century evolved. Now, the opposition of sectorial interest groups or the cost of the schemes proposed, I would argue, however, were only the surface or most obvious explanations as attempts to rationalize the drainage network in the Hull River Valley were modified, delayed, or never fully implemented. What's more important, and I think for those who really understood the system and how it was constructed, their insights give us some idea of really what's going on in the creation of the IDB network in the River Hull Valley. And here, first of all, I want to read out a passage from the report made by George Leather's report on the Beverly and Barnston drain in 1849. I think this, more than perhaps any of the comments, epitomizes what I'm trying to say here. I'm quoting from this report, quote, "Had we to consider the drainage of this district without reference to what had already been done, the task would be much less difficult. But after the large expenditure of capital, which the proprietors of the lowlands and cars have been called upon from time to time to advance, it becomes necessary to make best use of present works and expend as little in further works as the nature of the case will admit." Interestingly enough, similar sentiments were expressed by William Evans, surveyor to the Beverly and Barnston drainage for nearly 30 years in the late 19th century and early 20th century, in his evidence to the Royal Commission in 1927. Again, I'm quoting from him. I do not consider there is any physical or engineering difficulty in improving the river in any part of it, but the risk and cost would be so serious that it would be quite beyond the means of this drainage to attempt it, neither have you the power to do so. And the last quote I want to make in this respect is by a current IDB board member from this IDB, who reflected that, quote, it would be phenomenally difficult for them, he means the IDB, in fact, to rearrange the system that is actually set up, end quote, adding that, quote, when the 18th century engineers effectively put the system in, it was a solution to the problem, and unless it's maintained, this thing, i.e. the valley, goes back to swamp. So institutionally then, the Beverly and North Holderness IDB tends to be innately conservative, and maintaining the existing drainage system is, from their perspective, the primary reason for their continuing existence. When any radical solutions are suggested to divert or change the system, as for instance, there was a suggestion made to divert some 50% of the lowland water directly into the North Sea, and this was incidentally had already been one of the proposals made by Jessup in the 1790s, it was dismissed out of hand. As an IDB board member said, quote, when somebody thinks outside the box, it was a bit sort of too risque, and why don't we go for another solution? The solution for him was something which, interestingly enough, was something we'd already done. End quote. The board member then went on to qualify this remark by adding, quote, the thing is, I'm not sure if they can be innovative because the system is too difficult, end quote. Or to put this in terms of the argument that I'm making here, the infrastructural lock-in of the system basically serves to reinforce the institutional lock-in and vice versa. So what I'm arguing here is not simply a question of determining what was done in the past, but it's more about the order in which events take place that makes the difference. And in many cases, it's what happens earlier in the process that matters more than what subsequently takes place. So the history of draining in the River Hull Valley is not only a matter of time, but of timing, hence the title to my paper. Once a course of action is introduced, it can be virtually impossible to reverse. It is therefore essential to identify not only what these critical moments that shaped the basic contours of social and economic life took place when they took place, but also their outcomes in terms of the issues and problems that confront the world today. The condition of lock-in manifests in both the infrastructural and institutional nature of contemporary drainage in the River Hull Valley has important implications for contemporary water level management and flood risk management issues. Now, again, I noticed that I'm nearly taken up my half an hour. I could go on and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of this path dependency model. Suffice it to say that in my argument about this, I don't just simply see this path dependence as a weakness, but I can also see it as a strength. And I haven't got time to talk about these now, but in the question time, if you want to talk about where these strengths and weaknesses of this whole network system and how it's constructed actually work, I'm happy to do that. So let me just move to my conclusion then. So if we go back to the original quote from the engineer talking about the bottlenecking in the Cottingham culvert in 1940 and the problems that underlying the drainage in the River Hull Valley, they share, I would argue, a common history. Both systems have been constructed, quote, piecemeal over a considerable number of years and by different parties, end quote. And applying an historical approach provides insight not only into how this drainage system was formed and operated in the past, but also the vulnerability and resilience of its physical infrastructure and institutional nature today. The River Hull Valley, as it is today, is a physical and social construction over time by which a certain chain of events has created a drainage network that lacks flexibility and is thus rendered vulnerable to changes of a radical nature. Some of those changes, of course, are consequence about higher precipitation rates and changing climatic conditions. And I will end my talk there.